Zeitgeist 1980 is a Twine game I wrote last November for National Novel Writing Month. It drew heavily from 80s action comedies, specifically Burt Reynolds' Smokey and the Bandit 2 and Clint Eastwood's Any Which Way You Can. I took the movies, blended them together into a story about an 80s kid forced to spend a winter vacation driving his truck cross-country with his uncle while running from the mob. Suffice to say, it was 80s as fuck. I'm going to be porting the game over to Godot using Inkle's Ink scripting language and Ifred's InkGD implementation. There are a bunch of reasons for this, but chief among them is that I want to expand the content with further chapters based on other 80s movies as DLC, and that's a lot easier to do with Godot than it would be in Twine. The first thing I need to do is build the interpreter in Godot. Actually, no, scratch that. The first thing I need to do is design a user interface. I tend to do a lot of pre-planning when I have a project. I like to have the major decisions made so that when I get into that creative flow, I don't really need to pull myself out of it to figure something else out. So, user interface. The general theme I want to go after with the game is 80s movies. So how do we evoke that? Let's start by listing the screen elements that we're going to need. This should be a fairly large window of easily readable text because the player is going to be reading a lot of it. It can scroll, but the window has to be big enough that they can read an entire passage in one go. I don't want them having to scroll while reading, only if they want to go back and check something. Second, buttons to make choices. They should be big enough for use on mobile if we decide to export for mobile. These are the two core elements and our minimum viable product, the first thing we'll develop. But let's future-proof by planning for other elements. It'll be easier to account for them now than to try to adjust everything to accommodate them later. We'll need some kind of option bar or screen for loading, saving, quit, and any visual or audio options we have. Our game is going to have character traits. In the Twine implementation, they were largely a simple text list. We're going to use small graphical badges similar to what I used in the Unity demo Adventurer. Let's also use a space dedicated to some kind of graphical image. Adventurer's UI was patterned after gamebooks, but for Zeitgeist, our theme is movies. There were interactive fiction games in the 80s, but that's not really the mood I want to evoke. Movies don't really have UI, but home video was also huge in the 80s, and VCRs did have digital menus. We could possibly use a layout like a VCR sitting on top of a TV, but that kind of implies a lot of wasted space in our game frame, and we really need to make good use of what we have. What I like to do regarding resolution is start with a 4x3 resolution for our main game content, and then sort of expand out to a 16:9 rectangle with non-vital visual components. We can, if we choose, use those sides like sort of a television-like bezel, make it look like we're watching on a TV, and work within the 4:3 confines as our main gameplay screen. Within that screen, we can't do as much to make it look like a movie. This is a text game after all, but we can use a very 80s color palette and other design elements. But first, let's get back to the layout itself. I tend to let my limitations guide me here. In this case, it's primarily my lack of art assets. The Twine game didn't have them, so anything I come up with will be from scratch, and I can't afford to commission art, so that means that I'll be making it myself. For me, that means either heavily filtered, royalty-free stock art that I compose in Photoshop, or low-res pixel art, because frankly, that's all I'm capable of. Fortunately, low-res pixel art works very well with our 80s aesthetic, and it gives me an excuse to keep the graphical window small, meaning that we have more room for text. So, I spent some time researching other recent text games to see what's being done, but none of it really grabs me. A memory strikes me of Legend Entertainment's interactive fiction games in the early 90s. The Spellcasting series, Time Quest, Gateway. They used a relatively small graphics window, text, and button commands alongside typical parser entry. We don't need quite so many buttons or a text parser, but I'm able to come up with two similar layouts, and I quickly sketch out some boxes in Photoshop. Now, I don't have a lot of visual design training, but I have been making my own book covers for the last decade, so I'm inclined to go with the design on the left. I think the way it leads the eye is better for gameplay. In terms of a color scheme, I'm going to pick three primary hues that I'll vary for most of my elements, settling on an 80s pink, green, and yellow using the Peloton Color Picker tool. For accents, I'll use vibrant neon saturations, but for other screen elements, I'll go with softer pastels. Players are going to be staring at the screen while reading, after all. Similarly, I'm going to go with a simple sans serif font, Verdana, for my text, rather than something totally 80s. I want my players to be able to read comfortably. Usability trumps aesthetics. All of this takes me about a day, and I'm sure I'll tweak things as we go along. For now, though, it's time to implement the ink reader in Godot with some placeholder art and text. I've got a nice, easy pale pastel yellow as the text window's background, brighter greens for the choice buttons, and I've implemented a very 80s design underneath. I'm not sold on these colors as final, but there's time to tweak after the story has been implemented. The one thing I'm going back and forth on is the text. I'd like to break it up with some color so it's easier for the player to read with regards to skimming and scanning, but I don't want it to be too distracting. I may include a turn colored text off option, maybe a night mode, I don't know yet. But for now, my roadmap looks like this. First, we implement the Godot reader. This means not only the basic ink interpreter, but also deciding how I want to handle multiple chapters. For a game I plan to expand and release more content after release, multiple ink files is probably going to be my best bet. I'll also need to implement saving and loading. Next, port the story from Twine to Ink. This won't be difficult, just time-consuming. The Twine game itself is the size of a novella. This becomes the first chapter. Thankfully, I can copy and paste most of the prose. Once that's done, I will consider it a minimum viable product and give alpha copies to my supporters on Patreon. For them, it's a reward. For me, it's testing. Next, I'll find some music. I plan to eventually learn to compose chiptune to go along with my pixel art style, but for now I'll just find something royalty-free and very 80s to play in the background. After that, I'll start the long process of creating the game's art assets. With the layout I've created, I'm looking at a 320 by 320 pixel canvas, and for me that's much bigger than what I've been working with so far. I'm not sure how much art I'll want to create, maybe just one piece per scene, maybe one per character. I don't know yet. Once the art and music are implemented, I'm basically done with the first chapter. I'll release it into the wild and start working on the next one. This is also a sort of roadmap for this devlog series. I'll make videos as I reach each of these milestones, and maybe once I get to the art, I will live stream my moving of pixels around. If you want to see how I make this game and keep up with its development, then subscribe to the channel. Like the videos, comment and let me know if you have any questions or suggestions for me. Interaction like this keeps me focused and motivated.